Have 50,000 West Ham season ticket holders been misled by Daniel Kretinsky? Or has Vanessa Gold simply played the best hand in this entire ownership battle? Because whichever way this story eventually ends, there's one person who appears to have strengthened her position more than anyone else, and that's Vanessa Gold. Now, whether Amanda Staveley and her consortium eventually buy into West Ham, or whether Daniel Kretinsky increases his shareholding, or whether the existing shareholders collectively keep Staveley out, one thing seems incredibly clear. The value of the Gold family shares seems to have risen dramatically. And if that's true, then the biggest winner from all this may not be Daniel Kretinsky. It may not even be Amanda Staveley. It may simply be the person selling. Back in June, West Ham announced that Daniel Kretinsky had reached an agreement to buy approximately 16% of the Gold family shares. Assuming the deal completed, his ownership would then be increased from around 27% to about 43%. At first glance, it looked like the perfect outcome. Kretinsky would become the largest shareholder, something he wanted to do to go above David Sullivan's threshold. David Sullivan would remain a significant shareholder. The Gold family would still retain a stake in the football club, something that the late David Gold had always hoped would happen. Everyone appeared to get something that they wanted. And according to Kretinsky himself, the transaction was meant to be completed within a matter of weeks, except it didn't. Weeks passed, nothing happened, no announcement, no explanation, no confirmation that the deal had been completed. And then, just when supporters were beginning to wonder what had gone wrong, another name appeared in the picture: Amanda Staveley. Reports suggested that Staveley wasn't interested in buying just the 16% available to Kretinsky. She wanted the whole Gold family shareholding of 25.1%. At first, I think many of us assumed this had become a bit of a bidding war, Kretinsky versus Staveley. Whoever offered the most money would win. Simple, yeah? Except it's not that simple, because West Ham isn't a publicly listed company where shares can simply be bought and sold on the open market. It's a privately owned company, and private companies have rules. In West Ham's case, those rules are contained within the Articles of Association. Now, don't worry, I'm not about to spend 20 minutes trying to explain to you what it means. But before I do any of that, if you're new to this channel, or if you've watched the West Ham Voice before but yet to become a subscriber, click on that QR code, takes you to the subscription page, and you don't have to pay anything to become a subscriber of the channel. So, in terms of the Articles of Association, when you strip away the legal language, the principle is actually very straightforward. Imagine 5 mates who own a business. One of them decides to sell. Can they simply sell to the first outsider who makes an offer? No. The existing owners get the right, a first opportunity, to buy the shares that are available. Now, that's exactly what's happening at West Ham. The Articles of Association contain what's known as a preemption right. In simple English, existing shareholders get first refusal. So when the Gold family decided that they wanted to sell, Amanda Staveley's consortium couldn't just walk in and buy the shares straight away. The current shareholders had to be given the opportunity first. And that's the point that almost everyone seems to maybe overlook. They all think that the Staveley deal is done and dusted. But there's a legal process that's now kicked off. The moment a shareholder wants to sell, the articles dictate what happens next. The selling shareholder must formally notify the other shareholders. Now, that notice identifies the proposed buyer, the number of shares being sold, the agreed price, and the principal terms of the deal. Once that happens, every existing shareholder is entitled to buy a portion or a proportion of those shares based on the percentage they already own. Notice I said they're entitled, not obliged. They don't have to buy. No one has to spend a penny, but they all get the first opportunity to do so if they so wish. And if some of those shareholders decide not to buy, the process doesn't stop there. The remaining shares go into a second round, where those shareholders have committed money to get another opportunity to increase their holdings. Only after both rounds of the preemption process have been completed can any remaining shares be sold to an outside player. And even then, the sale has to be on the same terms, generally within defined time periods. So suddenly, this story looks quite different because Amanda Staveley isn't just negotiating with Vanessa Gold. She's effectively waiting to see what Daniel Kretinsky, David Sullivan, Tripp Smith, and the other shareholders decide what to do first. And that's where this becomes quite fascinating, because if those shareholders exercise their rights, Amanda Staveley's route into West Ham becomes more difficult. But if they don't, the door remains open for her. So let's put some actual numbers on this, because once you see the numbers, you kind of get a better understanding. I don't think it's really Amanda Staveley's story at all. It's about Daniel Kretinsky mainly, and the decision that he needs to be making moving forward. So let's put the numbers on the screen. And before we do that, I want to make one thing absolutely clear. What I'm going to show you is not a prediction. It's simply one possible outcome based on the current reported shareholdings. And one important assumption is that David Sullivan decides not to increase his stake at all. That may not happen, but he could still buy, even though he's resigned from the board, he still could buy additional shares if he so chooses. Using the assumption that we've got, well, it's not an assumption, this is what we currently have at the football club. David Sullivan owns 38.8%, Kretinsky 27%, the Gold family 25.1%, Tripp Smith 8%, and there's a minority sharehold of 1.1%. Now, remember, those 25.1% of shares do not immediately go to Amanda Staveley. They're first offered to the existing shareholders in proportion to what they already own. So in simple terms, the bigger stake you already have, the bigger sharehold of the 25.1% you can buy, you're more entitled to. So that equates to the following. It means that David Sullivan, if he chose, could buy 13%, Daniel Kretinsky 9%, Tripp Smith 2.7%, and the minority shareholders get 0.4% allocated to them if they so choose. Now let's continue with our example that David Sullivan decides not to buy any additional shares. The focus is on then on Daniel Kretinsky and what decision he makes. If he exercises his full entitlement, he'd purchase roughly another 9% of West Ham, but he'd have to do so at the same valuation reportedly offered by Amanda Staveley's consortium. They've offered £150 million for 25.1%. And based on those figures, it could cost him £54 million to purchase that 9%. But what it does, it increases his sharehold from 27% to 36%. That's round one of the purchase, his new sharehold of the preemption process. His new sharehold will go to 36%, and he will pay £54 million in order to do that. But the process isn't over there. But now let's talk about Tripp Smith as well, because if he exercises his right as well, he would be offered 2.7% of the Gold shares. It would cost him £16 million to do it, but he will take his stake in the club from 8% to 10.7%. He could exercise his right to do that as well. And Tripp Smith is going to be quite important moving forward in this conversation. So that would mean that if both Tripp Smith and Daniel Kretinsky exercise their right in the first stage of the preemption process, it leaves 12.4% of the Gold family shares still available for the second stage. Now, these remaining shares are offered to the shareholders in this second round. And based on the enlarged shareholdings, Kretinsky would potentially be entitled to buy another 9.3% of what's left, and Tripp Smith 3.1%. So for the remaining shares, Kretinsky's entitlement, another 9.3%, will cost him another £55 million. If Smith's went for his entitlement, the 3.1%, it'll cost him about another £18 million. Now that's quite a sizable amount of money. So basically, Kretinsky eventually spends £109 million, which will take his sharehold up to 45.3% for total cost. So jumping from 27%, first stage of the preemption process to 36% will cost him 55 million. Second stage of the preemption, if he bought all the shares, would cost him another 54 million. So it takes him to 45.3%. If Smith did the same, from 8% to 10% to 13.4%, it would cost him a total of 34 million pounds. And then that would mean there's nothing left in the kitty for Amanda Staveley to buy. But that may not happen. This is a scenario. And I guess the real question really comes down to, what does Daniel Kretinsky want to do? He said he's going to explore all options in the preemption process. The question is, how much is Daniel Kretinsky prepared to pay for West Ham United? There's a huge difference between wanting greater influence and writing a check for more than £100 million. Now, before anyone jumps into any conclusions, the figures are illustrative. I've already said this. They're based on the reported valuation attached to Amanda Staveley's offer of £150 million. If the valuation changes, or if any one of the shareholders makes a different decision, then the numbers obviously change. I've got a feeling that Kretinsky is going to probably push as much as he can. He would have had to already agreed broadly about £90 million to buy 16% of the Gold family shares. That's what he would have committed to in the first place. Staveley has now changed the narrative. She's changed the dynamics completely, because if another buyer has effectively established a higher valuation for the Gold family shares, which is what Staveley has done, every existing shareholder now has to match that valuation if they want to exercise their preemption rights. Which brings me back to something I mentioned at the very beginning. As Vanessa Gold actually played this perfectly. And when we think about it, back in June, Daniel Kretinsky had an agreement to buy 16% of the Gold family shares, as I said, for around 90 million pounds. The expectation was that he'd become West Ham's largest shareholder with around 43%. Everyone seemed happy. Then another buyer appears. Suddenly the discussion isn't about selling part of the holding, it's about selling all of it. And what appears to be a much higher valuation. Now, I want to be very careful here, because we don't know exactly what conversations have taken place behind closed doors. We don't know whether Vanessa Gold has delayed anything. We don't know whether Daniel Kretinsky was still working through the original transaction. And we certainly don't know whether Amanda Staveley's reported offer changed the family's thinking. But commercially, if someone offered you significantly more money for an asset, most people would at least listen, and most people will probably take it. If that's what's happened here, you can understand why this process has suddenly become much more complicated and why no conclusion has been done so far. And it brings us to the biggest mystery of all. If Daniel Kretinsky has the financial resources, why hasn't he simply pushed on to become the majority shareholder? Because that answer may have nothing to do with the Articles of Association. To become the majority shareholder, you need 51% or more. Now, this may lie in an agreement. Now, a lot of fans are predicting that he doesn't want to become the majority shareholder because of UEFA rules not owning two clubs at the same time. But that doesn't. That's not true, because there are several examples. Crystal Palace last season, where there was a conflict of interest, where they ended up having to play in another European competition. Marinakis from Nottingham Forest, he owns several football clubs, but if there was a conflict there, he put his shares in a trust to be managed on his behalf. So I don't think that's the issue here. I think the issue is about what else involves becoming the majority shareholder, because the answer may have nothing to do with the Articles of Association at all. It may lie in an agreement that none of us have seen. So let's finish where we've started. Have West Ham supporters been misled by Daniel Kretinsky, or has Vanessa Gold simply changed the narrative? Well, before we answer that, there's one final piece of the puzzle that we need to look at. Over the past week, one theory has gathered a lot of momentum online, that Daniel Kretinsky doesn't actually want to become the majority shareholder at West Ham, because once he reaches 51% or more, he'd somehow have to be forced to buy David Sullivan's remaining shares. Now, I've even had people tell me that this is written in the Articles of Association. So I've been looking, with the help of others, And here's what I found. The Articles of Association don't say that. They explain how shares are transferred. They explain the preemption process. They explain the rights existing to existing shareholders before any outside investor can buy any shares. But I couldn't find anything that says that crossing the 51% threshold automatically obliges Kretinsky to buy David Sullivan's remaining shares. Now, if Kretinsky matched completely Amanda Staveley's offer and bought through the preemption process, bought all the shares, he'd become the majority shareholder. But it simply means that there's no evidence in the articles. But what we don't know is that whether Daniel Kretinsky, when he invested back in 2021, there was something called a private put and call agreement between him and David Sullivan. Now, that agreement has never been made public, so none of us know exactly what it says. And that's an important distinction, because there's a difference between saying the articles require him to buy Sullivan shares and saying there may be a private agreement that would influence his decision. One is fact, the articles are fact, the other is an informed possibility. Now, until those private agreements become public, if they ever do, we simply can't say any more than that. Let's refer to a Bloomberg report that came out just the other day, because that specifically states that Kretinsky would have to buy these Sullivan shares if he became the majority shareholder. So what I found interesting was simply that, the suggestion is, it seems to suggest that Kretinsky doesn't want to rush into becoming the majority shareholder, if that's the case. Because once you understand the numbers, the hesitation makes a lot more sense. Now, the examples that I've used, if Kretinsky uses his preemption rights, he's already going to have to fork out £109 million to get up to 45.3% ownership of this football club. If there's an additional private obligation where he's then got to buy Sullivan shares, that becomes even worse in terms of what he has to pay out. But the original 16%, I could see where that made sense. He would have increased his stakehold to 43%. He would have become the largest shareholder. Job done. He would have had leverage over David Sullivan. But that is now gone, because Amanda Staveley's reported interest may have done something no one was expecting. It's reset the market. If her consortium has genuinely attached a significantly higher valuation to the Gold family shares, then every existing shareholder has got to make that decision. Are they prepared to match what Staveley has offered? And that's why I keep coming back to Vanessa Gold, because whichever way this ends, she appears to be in the strongest position. If Daniel Kretinsky exercises his right, he has to pay the higher valuation. If other shareholders decide to protect their positions, they too have to pay the higher valuation. In every one of these scenarios, the seller benefits. And that's why I don't think this is really a story about Amanda Staveley trying to buy West Ham. I think it's a simple story about where Daniel Kretinsky stands in this whole process. It's a story about leverage, about timing, and about one new bidder who may have fundamentally changed the economics of this entire deal. So let's go back to the question I asked at the beginning. Have 50,000 West Ham United fans been misled by Daniel Kretinsky? Personally, I don't think that's the right conclusion to reach. Did Daniel Kretinsky expect this process to take only a few weeks? Well, it certainly sounds like it from the statement that he's made. Has it happened? Clearly not. But based on everything I've read over the last few days, I think there's another explanation much more believable. The landscape has simply changed. The original agreement appears to be overtaken by recent events. A new bidder has entered the picture. The value of shares appears to have increased. The Articles of Association has triggered a process that everyone has to follow. And suddenly, what looks like a relatively straightforward transaction has become a much bigger and a much more expensive process. Now, I could be wrong. Absolutely. There are conversations taking place behind closed doors that none of us are privy to. There may be private agreements that completely change the narrative again. There may be commercial negotiations that haven't yet become public. And that's why I've tried throughout this video to separate what we know from what we think, because they're not the same thing. What we know is this. Over the next few weeks, over the next couple of months actually, existing shareholders are going to have some very important decisions to make. Those decisions won't determine who owns the club, but what percentage they have of the club. They'll help shape the future and direction of this football club, the investment, the leadership, the ambition, and perhaps even how quickly West Ham can return to where we all want to be. So maybe the biggest question isn't whether Amanda Staveley buys into West Ham. Maybe it isn't even whether Daniel Kretinsky becomes the majority shareholder. But the biggest question is simply this: how much is Daniel Kretinsky prepared to pay to become the man who controls West Ham United? Because if the answer is whatever it takes, we'll probably find out very soon. If it isn't, then this ownership story may have a few more twists before it's over. As always, those are my views based on what I know and from the information currently available. If new facts emerge, of course, I'll update you. But it's over to you. What do you think? Do you think Kretinsky has been outmaneuvered, or do you think this has been his plan all along? Let me know your thoughts in your comments. If you enjoyed the video, please become a subscriber, hit the like button, hit the bell notification, and there's also a hype button that you can click on as well. Thank you for watching and listening. I hope you have a good rest of the weekend.